Well, hello and welcome to a very different type of AF Advocates. Today, we thought we'd do a bit of a recorded interview. And that's because we have a very dear colleague and friend of the AEF, Dr. Jessica Walton here from Deakin University. Jessica is a senior research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. And Jessica's specialization is in issues related to intercultural education, multiculturalism, and racism. And she has done quite a lot of research in this space, has spoken at a number of conferences on these topics, and has had a particular interest actually in the way in which our relations with South Korea have evolved through different forms of education and learning. And today we're going to have a bit of a conversation with Jessica on intercultural learning and looking at communication and cultural contexts and aspects of relationships from children between those nations. So Jessica, to get us started, obviously the title of your recent research is quite apt. It's something in which often academic research doesn't often use very narrative, natural, easy to understand, accessible language. And I'm saying that in the nicest way possible. But this idea of the title, we laughed because those kids laughed, seems to sum up the way in which children navigated cultural and communication differences. Could you tell us a bit more about the meanings behind the title and how you settled on that title?
Thanks, Hamish. It's great to be able to talk to you today. And yes, the title, it's sort of a cheeky way to really get at the core issues of my research. And so, at first the students were quite reserved and they didn't know how to relate to each other. And then, one kid just got up and made a funny face or started laughing or getting really close to the camera so that they could see each other's faces. And that was really powerful. And it really broke down this idea of foreignness in particular, that, oh, those people are so different to me, I can't possibly relate to them. And they're like, oh, hey, we laughed because those kids laughed and we just laughed together, which seems really simple, but it's really powerful, especially at a primary school level.
So these children, just to make it clear, these children had never physically met. This was all a digital exchange. And can you maybe give us a sense of how their age and how long this period of work went on for?
Yeah, so my research went for 2 years, 2016 to 2018. And the students were in grade 5 and 6 in Australia and grade 6 in Korea because they don't have composite classes. They just have the individual grade level. So, but generally age 10 to 12.
And so, I think what's really interesting in this research paper that you've produced, you've advocated for much more authentic ways for students to relate to each other. And so you've sort of given that example, some of those examples are about the natural ways that just peer-to-peer learning can be overcome across, intercultural contexts when we allow children to approach it in a more, from a place of where they would like to approach it. And sometimes it is about pulling funny faces or just trying to break down some of the social awkwardness. Tell us a little bit more about some of the examples you observed and maybe what more can be done to support these kinds of experiences. And so, for example, one that I really was interested in your paper was the photo voice activity. So tell us a little bit about that and about some of the other examples you observed.
Yeah, so the photo voice activity, that idea is to not only center children's voices in research, but to really get a sense of core research issues that emerge from their perspectives and experiences. So rather than imposing this idea of, this is what intercultural communication is, and I'm going to see if you're meeting these standards that I've, it's about, okay, what are the students doing? How do they approach intercultural communication and what can we learn from them? So a research activity was to give them cameras and to get them to take photos of things that were of interest to them in their everyday life that they could share with their peers in South Korea or Australia. And that idea was to get a more holistic sense of who these kids were and not just limited to the 1 hour exchange that they did fairly infrequently. And so for me, it was important to, get a sense of how do they communicate? How do they relate to each other from their perspectives through these photos? And then how can I make sense of that in relation to what I'm seeing in the exchanges? So the students really loved that because they got a sense of, no, this person really cares about what I think. And so it was not just me as a researcher coming in and examining them. They had a bit of power in their hands to kind of inform me and teach me, which is really important in a way that I was able to kind of communicate with the kids on their level. Also, I wasn't a teacher, so they knew I wasn't going to discipline them or tell their parents, or, wasn't going to give them a test or whatever. So there was less pressure. So there wasn't that sort of power relationship there as much. Still an adult, of course, but they saw me more as a friend, like a big friend. So then that helped to kind of give more context to the project. But then within the exchanges, what the schools did, some of those activities that were more at that peer-to-peer level were the ones that the students really loved. So one example was they exchanged letters and they had little buddies. And so that kind of gave students time away from the pressure of the performative aspect in the online exchange. And then things like charades that, very basic games that you might do with very young children, but that was really appropriate in that setting because it didn't require that verbal mastery of Korean or English. They could hop around like a kangaroo and then have to guess. And so there was a bit of language that they needed to kind of guess the name of what the students were doing, but it wasn't dependent on that. And that really helped.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I think what you've highlighted there too is an opportunity where the idea of communication needs to be expanded beyond just the idea of we've got to speak to one another, you have to see one another, or sometimes things can get wrapped up in language exchange. And while Korean was one of those areas, it's nice to hear that there were other approaches adopted as part of that. It wasn't just seen as, right, it's time for your sort of Korean lesson. Let's bring on the Korean kids. I think that's sometimes where it can get a bit lost. And so this may be, from over that time, those 2 years, and you spent time obviously in Australia and Victoria with some of those children, and then you went to South Korea to spend time there as well. Over that time, and I suppose since that point, how has this research now changed or deepened your own insights on intercultural communication?
What really deepened my understanding, spending time with these kids, was that it's really about learning how to communicate. Of course, the students know how to communicate with each other because communication is something you do from day dot when they're born, but it was really about, okay, how do I approach a situation where I don't really know the language, I don't know who these people are, we're meeting for the first time, we can't and it's digital, we can't just kind of kick a ball around and kind of have fun that way. It's like screen to screen. And how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that's not just going to kind of reinforce this idea of meeting foreign people is too difficult, I'm not going to try, or reinforce stereotypes of, oh, Korean or Asian people are like this, or Australian people are like this. And so I think that's really key to any kind of exchange, to try and have a space where students can have some of that free time to just experiment. While that can feel kind of threatening, maybe from a teacher's perspective, because it's rowdy, it's noisy, it's not contained, there is, I think, a place for that. I mean, not the whole exchange, of course, but to give them some space to just get a sense of each other. And that sensing was, I guess, more student driven. So I guess my key learning was that you kind of had to take a few steps back before diving into this idea of, let's get this intercultural understanding, let's measure it, let's make sure that students are going to be prepared for living in a global world. And it's really about, okay, how do we teach our kids to have a more open mind towards people who might be seen as really different to them. One of the Korean students said a really powerful thing in the interview, and she said, this boy, he said, before doing this exchange, I wasn't friends with any people who were foreign. They used the word foreign, and it seemed really kind of scary to me. But after doing this, I really feel that they're my friends. And even another girl said, "Oh, I felt like I was with them in the classroom," because, and it was really interesting, really powerful that yes, it's digital, but the students were kind of what I say call reaching through the screen. They were, getting really close to the camera. They could see their different features. They were like doing all these bodily gestures, and their voices were going, I was in the Korean classroom. I could hear the Australian students' voices in the context of Korea. And then I flew back to Australia and I could hear the Korean students' voices in that classroom. And even just me kind of going back and forth, they're like, "Oh, we just saw you on camera a week ago, and now you're here in our classroom. How incredible is that?" So I think I was part of the exchange, and I like brought like Tim Tams. I think I brought an AFL footy ball for them, and just some physical objects where they can really connect. And again, another example is physical objects where kids can kind of show and tell. It's not just here's a hanbok, and I only wear this on holidays when I visit my grandparents, or it's not that kind of thing. It's like, okay, this is I like to play Minecraft, and even doing something like that, like doing online games between the students, because they'd be familiar with the same platform, and where they can just play with each other and not, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Look, I think everything you've actually talked about there, Jessica, is just right on point. I think sometimes that we need to provide the space for people, whether they're, and same experience actually we've had when we connect educators across international contexts. You have to provide that space to develop a relationship and a sense of friendship and a way of reading each other, and actually when it's digital, it's even harder to read each other. And so it's lovely when you watch children, almost, as I said before, get past that awkwardness. How do we just relax everyone by trying to laugh, or just trying to find something that we both go, that's the connector, whether it's Minecraft or in your paper is something where they were fascinated about the idea of dabbing, and being and going, wow, I didn't know that you know that, like the idea of how do memes and norms get communicated across cultures. And so I think they're all things that help battle the notion of stereotypes, and that's always a difficult balance. Stereotypes often are an aspect of intercultural learning. They're a way of us helping to understand some societies in general, but they're not good at all for understanding people, because there's so many other cultural things that we're part of. So Minecraft is its own culture. If you play Minecraft, the culture of that space and how people interact in that space. So it's a really interesting area. My last question to you is really about how might schools and educators move beyond sometimes that challenge of the skill and knowledge acquisition as a focus of intercultural learning, even though we know that's sort of an element of where we're trying to progress intercultural understanding. And through your research, how do you see mindset like playing a key role in terms of the role of the individual in that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think there's a distinction first between cultural understanding and intercultural understanding. And I think often cultural understanding replaces intercultural understanding. And, just take the pressure off teachers. I mean, sometimes when you think intercultural understanding, there's all these cultures in the world. How can I possibly know and teach my kids about Indonesia when I've never been there? Or how do I teach them about Korea when I don't know anything about that? And that feels like a lot of pressure. So I think taking that cultural understanding approach does put up that unnecessary pressure and misses the mark of what intercultural understanding is trying to do. So I think if we can just say, look, it's not just about learning about all of these different cultures. Of course, they have to know some aspects of it because there are differences. But the mindset aspect is, I guess, you could even start with a stereotype and be like, all Korean people do taekwondo, and then looking up, on the internet, examples that challenge that, like, baseball is a really big thing there. All these different sports, they play, and isn't just this national sport of Taekwondo, or that all Korean people eat kimchi, which a lot do, but I've definitely met Korean people who don't like kimchi, and they're like, "Am I Korean still?" Like, and of course
Yeah.
they are. Like, or even in Australia, I take a stereotype: all Australians like meat pies. That's not the case. There are people who are vegetarian or vegan. Meat pies are something you eat at footy games, or it's not like a dinner time thing necessarily. And so it's providing that more contemporary understanding of culture, that global understanding of culture, and the influences of migration. It's fine to talk about pizza in Australia and Thai food. There's just because it's part of Australian culture. It's not just that it's not Australian. Of course it is. And so it's really just, trying to look at everyday life, and to kind of build intercultural understanding. I guess there's like foundations of intercultural understanding. You might start out with things that are familiar, like school life, school culture. I think if you start with something really familiar, you can get into more of that deeper level of intercultural understanding. We're like, oh, I didn't realize that was different. Oh, in Australia we wear uniforms. In Korea we don't in primary school. Why is that? What does that say about our cultures? And just small entry points can really help challenge those stereotypes.
Yeah, and I think that's really captured through your research too, Jessica, because I think it's been a really interesting journey that you've actually written it in a very, very accessible way of capturing all those little moments, as you say, like the little moments that build up some better understanding. So I now know that not all Korean people are like this, or not all Australians are like that. And at the same time, developing that sense of connection and empathy with one another. Oh, we both care about this, or we both now connect through that way, or we now both know we like playing Minecraft, or we know what dabbing is, or whatever it might be. And it's through some of those common connections that we can then start to accept that there are also many differences. And so in future, I guess some of the learnings we want children and educators to have too is we won't go into it with the same assumptions. If that's how we have now changed our perception of Koreans, what might it be like for our perception of other cultural contexts? So it's a subtle thing. It's often in retrospect that you can look at it and see how you've changed. And I think through this work that you've done, Jessica, it's been an exciting journey to follow around how not only the children's relationships and understanding has changed, but also how you've talked about today about your own, how it constantly challenges our notion of what we perceive to be intercultural communication and connection.
Yeah.
Well, Jessica, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. I know we could probably talk for hours about all these different ideas and concepts and understanding, but it's been wonderful for this brief chat. Thank you very much for taking the time today to chat to us on AEF Advocates. And we look forward to, as I'm sure many do, reading more in your paper and your great work that you do. And we look forward to connecting again.
Thank you so much, Hamish.